Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 313 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the miracle of Calanda. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Throughout history, there have been many reports of miracles. For believers, they strengthen their faith in God, but skeptics routinely dismiss them. The church's attitude toward miracles is cautious. It recognizes that sometimes what looks like a miracle actually has a natural cause, and sometimes it's even due to hoax and trickery. So when miracles are reported, the church may do a careful, scientific and theological investigation of what happened and whether it was genuinely miraculous. And the church has certified certain miracles, such as healings, as being authentic. But skeptics still dismiss these. One of the charges they frequently make is, if God does genuine miracles, why doesn't he ever regrow somebody's limb? Why doesn't he take someone who doesn't have an arm or a leg and give them one? That's something that never happens. But is that true? Is it really the case that God never regrows a limb? Or is that something that happens after all? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, where do we want to begin today?
With a thank you to an independent researcher named Caleb Jackson. I was introduced to Caleb by Cameron Bertuzzi of the Capturing Christianity channel on YouTube. Cameron was setting up a 2-on-2 debate on the virgin birth between Christians and atheists, and Caleb was my debating partner. We did the debate last Christmas, and we'll have a link so that you can watch it yourself. Caleb's also written a couple of books. One of them was about the resurrection of Christ, and another one is on the problem of evil. And we'll have links to both of those so you can check them out. After we debated the atheists together, Caleb called to my attention a miracle that I wasn't previously familiar with. It's known as the miracle of Calanda, and he's including a chapter about it in a 2-volume work on miracles that he's currently writing. We'll update you and give you a link when the volume actually comes out. But for this episode, I'll be relying on the pre-final, pre-publication version of that chapter, which appears to be the most substantial resource on the miracle of Calanda in English. To compose it, Caleb had to go do a lot of research in other languages, including French and Spanish. So I want to thank Caleb for all the research he's done, for bringing this miracle to my attention, and for letting me use his research as the basis for this episode. Many thanks, Caleb. I also want to point out that despite the fact that the miracle of Calanda occurred in a Catholic context and was attributed to the Virgin Mary, Caleb himself is an evangelical Protestant, and it would be easy for him to just dismiss it. In fact, various Protestant authors who mention it have simply dismissed it, so the fact Caleb doesn't is a sign of how willing he is to follow the evidence where it leads, which is a mark of true open-mindedness, scholarship, and class, which are things that I appreciate here on Mysterious World.
Then let's begin by looking at the context in which the miracle of Calanda comes up. What do atheists actually say about miracles involving regrowing limbs?
They say things like this.
Prayer has never fixed anything physically impossible. Why won't God heal amputees?
So, as some have put it, why does God hate amputees? He at least occasionally heals those with cancer, back pain, bad eyesight, and MS. Why won't he heal amputees?
If, as theists, and especially Christians, tend to insist, God is willing to cure the odd illness, say cancer, why is it that he only heals ailments that also happen to heal naturally? If he's in the business of performing miracles, why not rejuvenate the odd limb? Why so discriminatory?
Some have even said that this is the kind of miracle that could convince them. For example, in his book, Faith versus Fact, biologist and skeptic Jerry Coyne writes,
So what would convince a skeptic like me of a miracle? A phenomenon that violated the laws of nature? Because humans, unlike salamanders, don't have the ability to regenerate lost limbs. If a religious leader could repeatedly regrow missing limbs by saying prayers over the afflicted, and this was documented with reliable evidence and testimony by multiple doctors, I would consider that a miracle, and perhaps evidence for God.
Of course, whether such individuals would actually be willing to accept evidence regarding such miracles is another matter. Hardcore skeptics, as opposed to genuinely open-minded people, have a way of moving the goalposts and dismissing evidence as non-evidence when they're actually presented with it. Now, to be fair, I want to point out that some skeptics are aware of restored limb miracle reports. Some seem not to be aware of this fact and act as if this is never even reported to happen, but others acknowledge that there are reports of it, which is good on their part. However, many of them simply dismiss these reports without really looking into them. Not all skeptics are the same, but the majority simply assume that the evidence for these miracles must be insufficient, and so they don't bother looking at it or giving it serious consideration, which I have to say is how many skeptics operate in many circumstances. It doesn't matter whether the subject is miracles or psychic abilities or UFOs or other unusual subjects. Skeptics frequently dismiss evidence out of hand and don't bother reading the evidence for themselves. Sometimes they even openly say things like, "Why would I waste my time looking at research into that subject?" However, the evidence that they casually dismiss is frequently there and frequently solid. As we're going to see in today's mystery, the evidence for the miracle of Calanda is very abundant and quite hard to simply dismiss.
Before we look at historical cases of limbs regrowing, do we have anything like that reported among the miracles recorded in the Bible?
There aren't a lot of people in the Bible who are recorded as missing limbs, much less seeking healing for this, but we do know of a couple of similar instances. One is when Jesus heals the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. We read about this when Jesus is being arrested in Luke 22.
And when those who were about him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him.
Some interpret this as Jesus reattaching the ear, which would be miraculous enough, but what the text says is that he touched his ear and healed him, which sounds like he caused the ear to regrow or at least seal over. Any way you take it, this is a healing involving an amputation. Another similar event occurs when Jesus encounters the man with the withered hand. This encounter is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but here's Matthew's version.
And behold, there was a man with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, whole like the other.
This isn't complete limb regrowth, but it's a miraculous limb restoration.
Are there historical reports of body parts being miraculously regrown?
There are. Some of them are only recorded centuries after the event allegedly occurred, and these are likely to simply be legends. However, there are others that were recorded close to when the event occurred. Caleb Jackson writes,
There still remain reports, centuries old, that are derived from the testimony of many formal witnesses rather than mere hearsay. The 11th century writer, Bernard of Angers, records several miracles associated with the Catholic cult of Saint Foy, many of which he expressed initial skepticism towards. Bernard appears to be persuaded of the legitimacy of such stories after speaking with various witnesses. Though the scholar does not record any accounts of missing limbs growing back, he does detail 2 cases of gouged eyes returning from their sockets after Saint Foy appeared to the blind men. Bernard personally interviewed both men, seeing the scars that still rested on their faces, and discussed the care he took to make sure that he was close up to the original witnesses who knew them rather than relying on hearsay. The German Catholic scholar Alfred Lappel likewise cites several miracles of this kind between 1623 and 1739, reporting from sources of the time. Lappel's list includes several higher-tier miracles of this nature. For example, in 1654, a child born with 2 tongues has one of the tongues suddenly disappear. Another account tells how in 1710, a French nun who was missing a kneecap and heel, had her deformed leg grow out 12 centimeters, or about 5 inches. In 1739, an Italian child born without bones from the waist down regained them inexplicably. Though accounts like these are often quite old, they occasionally have the benefit of being witnessed by many individuals, including doctors. Take, for example, the 19th century Spanish missionary Antonio Claret, who was recorded by local physicians as being able to heal many sick people who were brought to him. One particularly dramatic case involved doctors testifying to see a horrible wound in the side, exposing several ribs, instantly closing after Claret's prayer. Another account from a few centuries ago involves Charlotte Laborde, a Jansenist woman who had no legs at all. After prayer, she literally had 2 good legs pulled out of her. And this was apparently testified by 2 surgeons at the time on a published medical certificate.
In this episode, we're going to be looking at one particular miracle of this sort, the miracle of Calanda, and this one is particularly important because of how extensive the documentation on it is. Jackson continues,
There is one well-documented case of an amputee regaining back a severed limb after visiting a Marian shrine, backed by the testimony of dozens of laymen, officials, politicians, and even the relevant medical personnel who were initially present at the amputation. Though the case dates back to the 17th century, it is incredibly well supported by a primary source of the day and can be considered one of the most extensively documented events of the era. It had rightfully been called one of the most amazing miracles in history. The miracle of Calanda remains unparalleled centuries later, rivaling virtually all of the documented healings that the Church has recorded with the implementation of the Lambertini criteria from the 18th century onward.
What Jackson refers to as the Lambertini criteria are a set of conditions described by Cardinal Prospero Lambertini, who was elected Pope and took the name of Benedict XIV in the year 1740. Before his election, when he was still a cardinal, he wrote a famous work called The Teaching on the Beatification of Servants of God and the Canonization of Blesseds. It included material on how to evaluate miracles and private revelations, things quite closely connected with the saint canonization process, and it proved so influential that it's considered the classic work on the subject and is still used today. So the Lambertini criteria are the criteria that Prospero Lambertini laid out for evaluating whether or not something was certifiable as a miracle. These criteria began to be used in the 1700s, but since the miracle of Calanda was in the 1600s, they weren't yet being employed. Still, Jackson says the miracle of Calanda ranks up there with any of those later approved under the more strict Lambertini criteria.
Who was at the center of the miracle of Calanda?
His name was Miguel Juan Pellicer. He was apparently born in 1617, and he was from the town of Calanda in the Aragon region of Spain. When he was 20 years old, in the summer of 1637, he was severely injured. He was working on the farm of his uncle when he was run over by a cart, and the wheel of the cart crushed the tibia of his right leg. The tibia is the large bone in your lower leg. It's also known as your shin bone. The lower leg also contains another bone known as the fibula. I don't have any word on whether Miguel's fibula was also crushed, but if his tibia was severely fractured, I suspect that his fibula was as well. Following this injury, they immediately rushed him to a medical facility in the nearby province of Castellón. He was then moved to the hospital of Valencia. However, Jackson explains,
Treatment was unsuccessful in mending the bone, leaving Miguel to exit Valencia on August 8th as he traveled to the most refined medical institution in the region, the famed Hospital de Nuestra Señora de la Gracia, Hospital of Our Lady of Grace, in Zaragoza. The journey took about 50 days, with Miguel binding his leg to his thigh as he hobbled along on crutches in excruciating pain. By the time he arrived at the medical center in Zaragoza, his right leg had become blackened and gangrene. The hospital staffers were left with no alternative but to amputate the limb. Surgeons Juan de Estanga and Diego Miaruelo carried out the operation, sawing off the right leg 4 fingers below the knee and cauterizing the stump with fire to stop the bleeding. Miguel was only given alcohol for anesthesia.
Because there wasn't a lot besides alcohol that they could give you for physical pain in Europe back then. Now, 4 fingers is about 3 inches, so they disconnected his right leg about 3 inches below the knee, so he still had his upper right leg and a 3-inch stump below. When it comes to the leg itself that they removed,
the amputated leg was then placed in a box and buried in a grave approximately 8.5 inches deep in the hospital courtyard by a worker named Juan Lorenzo Garcia, as was routine practice. Miguel stayed at the hospital for several months under the care of Dr. Estanga before being released as an outpatient with a wooden leg and crutches around March 1638.
Of course, now that he had a wooden leg and crutches, Miguel really wasn't up to doing work on a farm like he had previously. Back in the 1600s, they didn't have tractors that you could drive around in, so you really needed both legs to do agricultural work, which is what the vast majority of people, including Miguel, were qualified to do. Miguel thus needed to find himself a new way to make a living.
Being a cripple, Miguel remained in Zaragoza and began his new life as a beggar in the spring of 1638, where he received a proper license to beg in front of the Cathedral of the Virgin of the Pillar as a pordiosera de plantilla, that is, a beggar for life.
That's right. Back then, if you wanted to become a beggar, you needed a license. There had been laws against people begging who didn't really need to in various parts of Europe for centuries. People who pretended to be disabled but who had perfectly sturdy bodies were known as sturdy beggars. And if you were repeatedly caught begging when you were actually sturdy, you could even be executed in some places. Back then, there wasn't much money in circulation, and they didn't want just anybody skipping work and sponging off others. People were already living hand to mouth, so they wanted to make sure that the only people who were begging were truly needy, and that was what would justify taking resources that other people otherwise needed to spend on themselves and their own families. So people took St. Paul's dictum from 2 Thessalonians 3:12 quite seriously. If anyone does not want to work, neither should he eat. So you needed to really prove to the local authorities that you were truly disabled and unable to work, and then they'd give you a license allowing you to beg. Since he was missing a limb, Miguel was able to do this, so he got his beggar's license, but he also was able to make some money on the side by work that he could do. In fact, beggars were expected to learn a trade to supplement their begging income. So,
the legless man was well known to both the layman and the clergyman and took on a job at the basilica as a lamplighter.
Miguel got work as a lamplighter at the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar in Zaragoza. And I should mention that Our Lady of the Pillar is an apparition that's famous in Zaragoza. Reportedly, in AD 40, James, the son of Zebedee, the apostle, was in Zaragoza when the Virgin Mary appeared to him. This would have been, at that time, an apparition of the living, since the Virgin Mary was still alive. Though James would not be for long because he was executed by Herod Agrippa I in AD 43. We don't have records of Our Lady of the Pillar until much later, so this story is almost certainly a legend. In fact, the New Testament seems to imply that James, the son of Zebedee, remained in Jerusalem through this period and thus didn't go to Spain. But that doesn't stop the people in Zaragoza from having an authentic devotion to the Virgin Mary under the title of Our Lady of the Pillar. And Miguel got a job as a lamplighter in the basilica commemorating her. Now, a lamplighter is what it sounds like, a guy who lights lamps. Public street lighting was developed in the 1500s, a century before Miguel's time, but this was in the days back before electric lighting. It was even before the gas lighting that came in the 1800s. So in Miguel's time, cities and towns had lamps on poles that were either oil lamps or weather-protected candles. And since you couldn't just flip a switch to turn them on, somebody had to go around and light them every evening and then quench the lights later at dawn. So there was a whole profession for lamplighters. The profession continued even after the introduction of gas streetlights, but it started to fade in the first half of the 20th century when electric streetlights began to become popular. That prompted the release in 1946 of a song called The Old Lamplighter that nostalgically looked back on the tradition of having lamplighters that used to go up and down the streets every sundown.
He made the night a little brighter. Wherever he would go, the old lamplighter of long, long ago. His snowy hair was so much whiter beneath the candle glow. The old lamplighter of long, long ago.
There are even still a few places in the world where they still have lamplighters in historic gaslight districts to give the tourists an old-timey experience. But there were lots of lamplighters in the 1600s, and since it wasn't a physically demanding profession, Miguel could do it to supplement the income that he made by begging. But once he finished his lamplighting duties for the evening, what did he do afterwards?
He was occasionally seen sleeping on the patio of the local hospital, though on the nights where he was able to collect enough alms, Miguel would stay at the local inn, Maison de les Tablas. It was during this period that he would routinely visit the hospital for checkups from Dr. Estanga, and he would notably take oil from the church's lamps to rub on his naked stump as he cried out for relief from Our Lady.
So Miguel was a lamplighter at the Basilica of Our Lady in Zaragoza. He would take oil from the lamps of the basilica and he would rub it on his stump as he prayed to the Virgin Mary for help. 2 years later, in 1640, he decided to take a journey back to Calanda to see his family, who he apparently hadn't seen since the accident.
Many neighbors who had known the cripple were thrilled to see him return to his village, but were distraught at seeing his right leg severed. The amputee attempted to continue work on the family farm, carrying bags of manure to and from the carts, but this proved difficult with his disability. He then decided to help support his family by begging for alms on the outskirts of Calanda, where he would expose his naked leg to raise pity in those passing by. This continued for around 3 days in the final week of March. On March 29th, 1640, Miguel told his family that he was feeling ill, and the group noticed a hard crust beginning to form on the end of his stump. The beggar then hobbled up to the bedroom where he would sleep for the night. Between 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. the same night, a pleasant scent of perfume spread throughout the home, raising the curiosity of the Pellicer family. The parents cracked open the bedroom door to see 2 feet sticking out of the bed. At first, it was believed that a soldier occupied the bed. A traveling soldier was being housed overnight at the Pellicer home during this time. But the parents realized that the pair of feet belonged to their son, who was using his soldier's jacket as a blanket. It was upon this realization that the family frantically awoke Miguel in fear and excitement, proclaiming that the Virgin had performed a miracle and restored the man's severed foot. Miguel awoke in a dazed state, explaining how he had just awoken from a dream in which the Virgin of the Pillar was anointing his missing leg with oil. This grogginess quickly turned to shock and excitement when Miguel looked down to see that his leg had now been fully restored.
And so the reported miracle of Calanda had now occurred. Miguel's right leg was suddenly back, following a dream of the Virgin Mary anointing his stump with oil, just like he used to rub his stump with oil back in Zaragoza when he prayed to her at her basilica. However, even though the leg was instantaneously back, it wasn't yet in perfect condition.
His restored appendage was originally blue and slightly retracted, being several centimeters shorter and quite hard to the touch. Neighbors recounted how over the next several days, Miguel was seen in public with 2 feet, walking with a cane and unable to move his right foot with much ease. After a few more days, the man regained the ability to walk as his foot took on its original color. Witnesses saw him sprinting in front of their eyes and showing off his flexibility by putting his right leg behind his head. The leg would grow out to its pre-amputation length around 3 months following the healing.
And so it took a few months for the leg to be fully restored.
What happened in the wake of the miracle?
Well, this was in Spain, and
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise are 2 weapons. Our fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency are 3 weapons. Our fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope are 4. No. Amongst our weapons. Amongst our weaponry are such elements as fear. I'll come in again.
yes, well, actually, it wasn't yet time for that. But as you can imagine, the reported miracle made a big impression on the local populace.
News of this miracle spread like wildfire throughout Calanda and its neighboring regions. On April 1st, 1640, the parish priest of Mazaleon, Don Marco Seguer, traveled to Calanda with his notary, Miguel Andrew, to investigate. A 2-page certificate was produced summarizing the testimonies of 10 witnesses who claimed to have seen Miguel both before and after the miraculous healing. This is our earliest primary source available in which testimony for the miracle can be derived, being transcribed a mere 3 days after the initial healing.
So that's really good. The miracle itself was reported late at night on March 29th, and just 3 days later, on April 1st, the parish priest and an assistant arrived to investigate. They took testimony from 10 witnesses, and these witnesses said that they saw Miguel both before and after the miracle. So they saw him without his lower right leg, and then they saw him with his lower right leg back again. And this is documentation from just 3 days after the miracle occurred. So it's not like this is a story that emerged centuries later. It was documented almost immediately.
On April 25th, Miguel traveled with his relatives back to Zaragoza, the city in which both the amputation and Miguel's institution as a legal beggar had occurred, in order to pay alms and give thanks to Our Lady of the Pillar. It was here that the clergymen and townspeople who had known the boy as a crippled beggar not more than a month ago saw firsthand his new leg. Further investigation was then initiated by the Archbishop of Zaragoza, who set up a formal inquiry on June 5th of that year, and a trial to determine whether the alleged healing was genuine or fraudulent. The Archbishop commissioned a panel of representatives from both churches of the region, the beloved Pillar Cathedral and the older Cathedral of El Salvador. The 2 congregations were notorious for their dislike of the other, but both were included to mitigate any potential bias held by the Pillar's affiliation with Miguel during his time as a beggar and lamplighter at the church. The inquiry consisted of a jury made up of doctors and professors of the University of Zaragoza. As one author notes, the probe was noteworthy for excluding all clergy and instead was an entirely secular process, being carried out with the help of 3 notaries and 24 witnesses. The hearing took approximately 1 year, with 24 witnesses testifying under oath that they had known Miguel when he was an amputated beggar on the street and had likewise seen him with 2 legs following the healing. Witnesses were questioned in part by bringing them into a room with Miguel reclined in a chair, his right leg exposed for examination. Those being interrogated were asked if they recognized Miguel, if they had previously known and seen him as a legless cripple, and to carefully view the now restored leg to verify that it was real flesh.
So this is also really good. They did a year-long examination with a panel of representatives from 2 churches that had a rivalry going, so the inquiry wouldn't be biased by representatives of the basilica where Miguel had been a lamplighter. The panel was made up of doctors and university professors, and it was entirely secular in composition. It did not include any clergymen. lest they be overly credulous or have theological or other motives to back the miracle. And I would note today the same procedure is used when the church investigates miracles today. They ask people to look at the scientific data who are experts in science, and they don't care what their religion is. They even have atheist scientists give their opinions on the data. And only after this phase of the inquiry is concluded that what happened is scientifically inexplicable, do they bring in theologians to evaluate it. The inquiry also invited witnesses who had known Miguel when he was a beggar on the street and didn't have his leg, and they let them examine the newly restored leg to make sure it was real. It's at this point that the Spanish Inquisition becomes involved. I said it's at this point that the Spanish Inquisition becomes involved.
Oh, bugger.
Yeah, well, anyway.
Each of these testimonies was recorded in the official minutes of the Inquisition between June 5th to June 30th, 1640. The 24 witnesses who officially testified under oath in the trial consisted of individuals from various walks of life. Some were relatives, neighbors, and friends of Miguel who knew him before the accident and had seen and touched his amputated stump when he returned home from Zaragoza. They swore under oath that, quote, on that occasion and many others, Miguel Pellicer showed his sick leg naked to the neighbors of his parents' house and to many others, and they touched the cut leg with their hands, end quote. Other testifiers were local authorities of Calanda. 6 different individuals in the neighboring regions of Calanda and Zaragoza stated that they had seen the young man begging and showing off his stump. Quote, Miguel would ride his donkey to the neighboring villages and quest for alms. To arouse pity, he would show off the stump of his cut-off leg. In the villages where he goes to beg, Miguel shows in the open what is left of his leg. End quote. Finally, and most importantly, are the testimonies of 5 physicians and nurses, 2 of which derive from the surgeons of the La Hospital de Nuestra Señora who amputated the leg. Another 2 staffers at the hospital had been involved in the initial amputation and the months of post-operative care that followed.
And we'll have a link to where you can read the records of the investigation online, though they are in 17th century Spanish. But with this seemingly quite thorough and impressive investigation having been done, that puts us in a good position to look at the miracle of Calanda from the perspectives of faith and reason.
And before we do that, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Tom G., Matthew W., Mike and Lisa S., Kimberly S., and Mark Y. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. So, Jimmy, what theories do we need to consider about the reported miracle of Calanda?
Well, as with any paranormal investigation, we need to begin by thinking of natural, non-paranormal explanations and then considering those first, because normal events are more common than paranormal ones. The first theory that I think we need to consider is whether some kind of mistake could have been made. That is, that the people who saw the alleged miracle were innocently mistaken and just misinterpreted what they saw. Next, we need to consider the possibility that some kind of rare natural human ability was involved. You know, there are life forms that can regrow limbs, so perhaps humans are among those. Third, we need to consider the possibility of a hoax. That is, that there was no miracle and that somebody was deliberately using deception to create the impression that there was. Fourth, and here we enter paranormal territory, we need to consider whether something psychic could have happened here. Could there have been a psychic healing rather than a miraculous healing? And finally, we need to consider the possibility that the event was indeed miraculous.
Then let's go through the different theories. What can we say about the mistake theory? How could people make an innocent mistake about the fact that someone used to not have a leg and then they had it back again?
I can actually think of several ways this can happen. I won't go through them all, but for example, maybe Miguel had a twin and Miguel's leg got amputated, but the twins did not, or vice versa. And then people got the two of them confused. The problem is that if someone had a twin, then that's known ahead of time. And when asked about the possibility of a twin, the Italian author Vittorio Messori, who wrote a book about the miracle, responded,
"Not a twin, because the parish registers of Calanda have been preserved, and Miguel Juan Pellicer has no twin. In the dozens of pages of the process, the whole family situation is examined, and all possible questions are asked, even the most insidious."
So the twin theory doesn't really work, but another possibility is that it could have been a look-alike in Zaragoza. After all, a hospital has many patients, and it's possible that two of them looked similar and one of them had an amputation while the other did not. But here again, there are problems. If the amputee then became a beggar and a lamplighter at the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar, what happened to the beggar after Miguel returned to his home 2.5 years later? Why didn't he just keep begging in Zaragoza? And more importantly, what happened to Miguel for the 2.5 years between the accident and when he returned to his family home? Where was he for all that time if he wasn't a beggar? And why did he show up back in Calanda appearing not to have a leg? Most fundamentally, and this is a problem for all of the innocent mistake theories, why did Miguel say that he was an amputee, had been the beggar, and then had his leg restored? You could say Miguel was lying about this, but then it didn't involve an innocent mistake. It involved deception. So I don't think any of the innocent mistake theories work.
What about the idea that his leg could have come back through some sort of natural ability? There are animals like lizards, salamanders, and starfish that can regrow body parts that have been severed.
There are, and to appreciate that, let's get a little background on the subject. And be aware, no actual salamanders were harmed in the making of this video.
We're going to have a look at the way in which an amputated limb grows over the course of about 90 days in a salamander. That's a time-lapse movie, watching that thing grow. And now we're going to see what's really going on. Here's the salamander, and it's got a completely new limb. It looks perfect. It has inside bone. It has nerves and muscle, and it can even wiggle. In fact, it's perfect. Now we're going to cut it off. But here's the good news. It grows back. So don't be too scared. First, wound healing. Did you see that wound heal? Now we're watching what the newt can do that we cannot do. Cells are streaming out of the surrounding tissues into the area of the wound and forming what we call a blastema, which is a group of undifferentiated cells that are in fact really just like stem cells. And they're multicolored because they come from skin, from muscle, and even from cartilage. And these have a miraculous memory of what they used to be and are able to form a perfectly functional limb.
Humans don't usually form blastemas, though, when we have a limb cut off. Instead, we quickly form scar tissue over it. Scientists speculate about why this is. One possibility is that it's to keep us from having even bigger problems with cancers, which are uncontrolled growths of cells. However, there are other theories.
When a lizard's tail falls off, a bunch of pluripotent stem cells rush to the stump and form this mass called a regeneration blastema. The pluripotent stem cells will differentiate into skin cells, muscle cells, or bone cells, any type of cell the lizard might need to regenerate a tail. But why can't humans regrow an arm? Scientists think it's an evolutionary trade-off. Those lizards have small bodies, and it would take one of them a couple weeks to regrow the tail, but it would take a lot more time and energy for one of us to regrow a whole arm. plus the added energy it takes to keep the pluripotent stem cells in reserve. So instead of wasting all that time and energy, we just grow some scar tissue over the wound and learn to live without an arm.
But humans can regrow some things. We obviously regrow skin, which covers our wounds, and we can regrow up to 75% of our livers. Human children can even sometimes grow back their fingertips if they get cut off, with not just skin, but fresh new flesh, fresh new bone, and new fingernail. This ability doesn't appear to be found in adult humans, but there are new ways of trying to induce the ability.
Lee's a skilled model maker who works in a hobby store. One day in 2005, he was talking to a customer about an airplane and had a terrible accident.
I was squatting behind the wing of the airplane, and I raised my hand and pointed to the engine and told the gentleman he needed to get rid of that engine. And doing that, I put my finger through the end of the prop and cut off about a 3/8 to a 1/2 inch of the fingertip.
Normally, an accident like this would mean a trip to the ER and spending the rest of your life with a hacked off finger. But Lee had an ace up his sleeve. His brother Alan was a research doctor who had spent years working on limb regeneration. He developed an experimental powder, though it had never been used on humans. Lee agreed to try it and had some shipped to him.
So go in, take a shower, let the Band-Aid wash off your hand, and then pat it dry with a completely clean towel. And then I want you, while it's still wet, to pour the powder over the injury by just putting it over the top and then putting a Band-Aid over it, which is exactly what I did.
After doing this every day for a few weeks, his fingertips started to regrow, even the nail.
My next statement to my brother was, "How will it know when to stop?" And he said, "It'll know." So it did, in 4 weeks, completely regrow.
I've heard about young kids growing back a fingertip, but never an elderly man. Now, Dr. Stephen Badylak at the University of Pittsburgh is spearheading an investigation into exactly how this magical powder works. And though he can't yet read the signals, Badylak believes they come from chemicals floating around in the soup between the cells, something called the extracellular matrix.
The extracellular matrix for a long time was considered to be nothing more than the glue that held cells together. But in the past 20 years, we've learned that it's an information highway between cells that can tell cells, for example, you should be dividing, or you should be migrating, or you should be differentiating into a piece of bone or a piece of muscle.
And here's where the mysterious white powder comes in. Lee Spivak's brother made it from the extracellular matrix of pig bladders. That's right, the power to regrow a finger came from a farm animal. There were no actual pig cells in the powder, just the dried extracellular matrix. And when Lee sprinkled it on the wounded end of his finger, bam, it turned back into soup. So maybe, just maybe, that pig soup generates growth signals for the cells, the same way blood does when we cut ourselves. If I cut my finger, blood seeps into the wound, creating an environment full of signals telling cells to regrow. But if a cut goes really deep, the body can't fill the entire hole with blood. No matrix, no signals, no regrowth. All that's left is a big scar. But if you apply dried matrix materials from a pig, it creates a thin layer filled with signals that tell the cells to grow back. Day by day, one thin layer at a time, the finger heals itself.
So I think even major body parts that are lost, like a hand, we will learn how to regrow functional heart tissue, I'm convinced. I think these are within the foreseeable future. I'm an optimist, but also a realist, and I think the future is very bright.
So in the future, we may have the ability to regrow limbs. And some people even have astonishing limb growth abilities right now. For example, there is a British woman named Mandy Sellers. She was born with abnormally large legs, and they just kept growing. Even though her upper body is small and fit, her legs grew to ginormous size. At one point, they weighed 17 stone, the legs, which is 238 pounds or 108 kilograms just for the legs.
37-year-old Mandy Sellers from Accrington in Lancashire was born with giant legs. Until 2010, she could walk, which meant she could live her life without being dependent on others.
Mandy's fiercely independent, and she's extraordinary because she keeps going.
Her amazing positivity and strength and determination is something that you don't find in many people. It's quite a unique thing.
Because Mandy always finds ways of doing things. Obviously, some other people might just say, well, I'm going to give up, but that is not Mandy.
But in 2010, Mandy developed an infection in her left foot and had to have it amputated.
Mandy doctors thought that when Mandy had a leg amputated, life would improve. But in reality, it's actually become a lot harder.
In a cruel twist, the operation has triggered faster growth in Mandy's stump. As in the past, liposuction has also done.
Well, the stump just won't stop growing.
Okay. Done this a few times.
It accelerated and it went bigger, didn't it, for some unforeseen reason.
Today, Mandy is at the Specialist Mobility and Rehabilitation Centre in Preston with her friend Sue, having her stump measured.
104, 107. So as I'm going down, we can see that we've got a volume increase. That's a 110.
Mandy's leg is 6 centimetres wider than when it was last measured 3 weeks ago.
Somewhere in me there's something that's saying, you must grow, and there's nothing that stops it. It just simply carries on and carries on.
So because of an infection, they had to amputate one of her legs above the knee, and when they did so, it sparked a period of rapid growth in the leg. Previous attempts at liposuction or fat removal had similarly triggered further growth. Now, the good news for Mandy is that they found a drug, rapamycin, that reduced her alarming leg growth. But for our purposes, we have to ask whether this could be responsible for what happened with Miguel Pellicer. If some people, like Mandy Sellers, have abnormal leg growth, and in Mandy's case, the growth was triggered by having her leg amputated, then perhaps Miguel had a similar condition. Maybe his legs didn't grow to giant size, but maybe he had the unusual ability to regrow a leg, and this was triggered when his leg was amputated.
Or like we heard about with the man whose fingertip was chopped off and grew back when he rubbed the special powder on it. Maybe Miguel's leg was restored from rubbing the oil from the lamp on it. What do you think about those natural possibilities of explaining the reported miracle?
I see 3 problems with them. First, lamp oil does not have the ability to regrow legs. The powder that was used in the case we heard about came from the intercellular matrix of an animal that is somewhat similar to humans, but the oil Miguel used was just not the same stuff, and oil has been put on wounds for literally millennia. In Luke 10, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus mentions the Samaritan putting oil and wine on the wounds of the injured man in the parable. And that makes sense because wine contains alcohol, which is a disinfectant, and oil is soothing. So these substances have some therapeutic effect. But if they had astonishing wound healing and limb regrowth abilities, we would have known about it millennia ago. Then there's the second problem.
With more research into the axolotl's genome, we'll be able to develop a much better understanding of what's going on. And from this, maybe we'll understand how a similar system could work within us. But it probably wouldn't actually be as good as it sounds. I mean, look, it takes axolotls and other salamanders tens to hundreds of days and even years to fully regrow their limbs, which means that it would likely take us like 15 to 20 years to do the same thing.
And that didn't happen with Miguel. He went to bed one night, and between 10 and 11 o'clock, his leg was discovered to be fully regrown. That kind of instantaneous growth would be completely medically unprecedented. Starfish don't have that ability, lizards don't have it, salamanders don't have it, and humans like Mandy Sellers don't have it. But Miguel got his complete leg back in a period of at most a few hours. There is no scientific basis for anything like that. And then there's the third problem, which is that it doesn't look like Miguel's limb actually regrew. Instead, it looks like his limb was reattached. You'll recall that we heard earlier
The amputated leg was then placed in a box and buried in a grave approximately 8.5 inches deep in the hospital courtyard by a worker named Juan Lorenzo Garcia, as was routine practice.
Well, as part of the investigation, they went back and dug up the box, and they found it empty. In the interview he gave, they put the following to Vittorio Messori.
According to the testimonies, Miguel Juan Pellicer's miraculous leg has not, if we can say so, regrown. It is precisely the same leg that had been amputated more than 2 years earlier, and which, buried in the earth, was necessarily rotten, to have reappeared, a kind of resurrection of the flesh that took place before the end of time.
Messori responded by saying,
Yes, the leg was immediately recognized. It had all the unmistakable signs that were on the amputated limb. The scar caused by the wagon wheel that had fractured the tibia in the accident that had resulted in the amputation. The traces of a dog bite on the calf. The remains of a large cyst removed. 2 deep scratches left by a thorny plant. In short, a leg cut when it was already devoured by gangrene and buried for 2.5 years in the cemetery of the hospital in Zaragoza is suddenly replanted in Calanda, 100 kilometers away. When they went to check the place where the limb had been buried, they found the hole empty. The first few days, the leg, according to the testimonies, looked like dead flesh. It was cold, bluish, and over time, the flow of blood returned to normal.
So it looked like the same leg had miraculously been brought back, not that a new leg had been regrown. This was a teleportation and reattachment, not a regrowth. The natural explanations for this event thus do not look promising.
What about the possibility of a hoax? People hoax things all the time.
Oh, indeed. I've even seen people pull hoaxes with injured legs. Once I was in Nazareth, in Jesus' hometown, and as I was walking up the sidewalk towards the Basilica of the Annunciation, there was a beggar sitting there. And to gain pity from the passers-by, he would conspicuously pull up his pants leg, revealing what looked like an open bleeding wound, which was quite shocking. But a second's reflection indicated that no beggar would just be sitting there with an open bleeding wound. If he really had such a wound, it would be treated and bandaged up. And even if he neglected doing that, it would have scabbed over and healed itself. The only way for him to have an open bleeding wound would be if he was constantly picking it open again, which would be very painful and also which was very unlikely. So I concluded that this gentleman was a faker, that he was using makeup or paint to create the impression of an open bleeding wound, and it actually looked like red paint, not actual blood. And then he'd conspicuously pull up his pant leg when tourists walk by to generate shock and sympathy and get more money out of them. So I'm quite aware of the fact that beggars can pull hoaxes with their legs to get money. Now, there are 2 possible ways that a hoax could have been executed in this case. The first one is that the new leg was a hoax, and the second is that the amputation was a hoax. In the case of the first possibility, Miguel's leg really was amputated, and he then used a false prosthetic leg to fool people into thinking that he had the original back. However, this is very implausible. People knew about prosthetic legs back then. In fact, Miguel had a wooden leg that he used after the amputation. But people could clearly distinguish between his wooden leg and the post-miracle leg. In fact, people touched the new leg and within a few days found it warm to the touch as blood flow returned. They also recognized it and the different scars that he had on the leg, as we just heard. During the investigation, they let people come up and touch and examine it, and they simply did not have the prosthetic technology in the 1600s that would enable it to withstand that kind of scrutiny. In fact, we don't have mechanical legs good enough to pass as real ones now, so I don't think this version of the hoax theory works.
What about the second possibility? Could Miguel have just been lying about the amputation and just kept his lower leg hidden? His family hadn't seen him since he left for Zaragoza before the amputation, and then they found him asleep with both legs. Could he have just made up the story about having his dream of the Virgin Mary on the spot and pretended to be miraculously healed? That explained why the new leg had the same scars and marks on it that the original leg did.
It would, and this could even explain the initial appearance of the leg after the reported miracle. It was initially bluish and cold and shorter than the other, but that would be easily explained because if Miguel had been pretending to be an amputee in order to beg for 2.5 years, he would have had to keep his lower right leg concealed from view all that time. That means he would have needed to keep it bent and to bind it up out of sight for the vast majority of the time. That could reduce things like blood flow, making it cold and blue, and it could cause muscles to atrophy, causing it to be shorter than the left leg until he started using it once more and built up the muscles again. But there are a bunch of problems with this version of the hoax theory. One of them is how Miguel could have tricked the authorities into letting him have a permit to be a beggar. Like we said, they were really serious about not letting people get out of work and consume community resources when people were living hand to mouth, and they made you re-qualify as a beggar every year. Since Miguel's period as a beggar lasted for 2.5 years, he would have needed to fool the authorities at least twice, maybe 3 times, into thinking that he was an amputee when he was not, and that's rather improbable. Another problem is the fact that he was known to sometimes sleep outside in a public space, but it's really hard to keep your lower right leg hidden when you're asleep in public. So by sleeping out in the open, where people could and did see him, Miguel would have been risking exposure of his fraud. In fact, that's how the miracle reportedly was discovered. Miguel went to sleep and his family discovered him with 2 good legs. So he would have been taking a notable risk by sleeping in public where anyone could just walk up and look at him.
Still, fooling the people who gave him his beggar's license wouldn't have meant fooling them for more than a few minutes once a year, and Miguel might just be a risk taker who wanted to sleep outdoors sometimes, and he might have even planned to say, "It's a miracle," if anyone ever caught him with both legs. Are there more serious problems than these?
There are, and we're about to see that any theory that depends on Miguel being a lone hoaxer simply will not explain the evidence. You'd have to propose a conspiracy of people, and as we'll see, it would have had to be a very large conspiracy. To see why, let's walk backwards through the testimony concerning Miguel, beginning with when he arrived back at his family farm. Jackson reports that the Commission of Inquiry took testimony from
around 10 neighbors of the Pellicer family who testified that they had known Miguel prior to the accident. They had on separate occasions met with Miguel when the amputee arrived back in Calanda in March 1640 with a wooden leg. When asked about the accident, Miguel removed the peg leg to show them the wound. They then touched the part where the leg was cut and would claim this happened on multiple occasions. Multiple neighbors then saw Miguel with 2 legs a few days later following the miracle, with Miguel leaning on a crutch as the new leg was hard and cold. In the following days, the witnesses saw Pellicer regain mobility as the foot grew out and regained color.
So around 10 neighbors from Calanda testified that they had, on multiple occasions, seen Miguel remove his wooden leg, and then they touched the stump, the part of the leg where it had been cut. So they should have detected it if he had a lower leg tucked up under his knee. They then saw him again with 2 perfectly good legs, though the new one took a few days to be fully back to normal. Now, let's take a step backward in time to Miguel's time in Zaragoza.
Pascual del Cacho, presbyter of Santo Hospital de Nuestra Señora de Gracia, testified to witnessing the patient recovering in a hospital bed, having been told by staff that he'd been operated on by Juan de Estanga. He witnessed the severed leg lying on the floor following the operation and heard from staff that it had been buried in the hospital's courtyard. Pascual would occasionally care for Miguel during his recovery at the hospital between October of 1637 and March of 1638.
So, being a presbyter or priest assigned to the hospital, Father Pascual testified to caring for Miguel during his convalescence in the hospital. which lasted from October to the next March, a period of 5 months. So why would the hospital keep Miguel in bed for 5 months if he wasn't recovering from an amputation? Further, Father Pascual witnessed the severed leg itself lying on the floor after the operation. Now, moving back in time again, we come to what happened to the leg. The following testimony comes from a hospital staffer named Juan Lorenzo Garcia.
He saw that the patient, Miguel, had been taken from the surgical ward, who seems to him to be the same one who has been shown him, whom he does not know by name, only seeing him with a wounded leg. The dean saw the leg cut, the same that has been shown to him of Miguel Juan Pellicer. The deponent is the one who picked up that leg after it was cut off and took it with another companion of his to bury. They buried it, and this said to be true under oath.
So under oath, Mr. Garcia testified that he saw Miguel being taken out of the surgical ward and that he and a companion buried the leg. So he's saying, I put that leg in the ground myself. Walking backward in time again, we come to Dr. Diego Miarruelo, who assisted with the amputation.
Miarruelo claimed that he knows Miguel Juan Pellicer, and he saw in a hospital bed Miguel Juan Pellicer with a gangrenoted leg, and saw that Juan de Estanga had applied many medications to it, but it didn't work. Seeing this, Juan de Estanga decided to cut the leg because he didn't see any other solution. He claimed this under oath. After they made deliberation from above, they cut the leg, and he knows this because he was present when they were cutting it, and he helped with this, and he saw it cut, and he claims this to be true under oath. He said that he knows and saw one of the young men in the surgical ward was taking the leg to bury it, and that he heard that they put it in the graveyard, and he claims this to be true under oath. He said that he knew well and saw that after they cut the leg, Juan de Estanga continued to treat the remains of the leg until it made a scar, and he claims this to be true under oath. He claimed that about a month ago, more or less, he knew that Juan Pellicer was in the city, and he decided to visit him, and he saw him, and as it was previously said, and saw that his leg had been amputated, but he now saw that the leg had regrown, although he couldn't put much pressure on the foot or move it freely. And he saw Miguel Juan Pellicer with his parents, and he claims this to be true under oath.
So Miarruelo said that he attended Miguel's case before the amputation. He saw the gangrenous leg. He saw the chief surgeon in the case, Dr. Juan de Estanga, apply many treatments to it, but the treatments didn't work, so they decided to remove the leg. Dr. Miarruelo then saw the leg cut off. In fact, he assisted in cutting it off. But then, when he heard Miguel was back in the city, he went to see him, and he saw that he had his leg back, and he testifies to all this under oath. Now we move back to the chief surgeon himself, Dr. Juan de Estanga.
And what he can say about that miracle is that about 2 years or more ago, he moved to the surgery block and found a boy who is the same person that has been shown to him today. And by that moment, he didn't know his name, and they had an injury in the leg, and he tried to cure it. And although they applied many treatments, these did not work because the leg was too severely injured. He resolved to cut the leg because, in his opinion, the named Miguel Juan Pellicer would have died about 2 years and a half ago, more or less. After making the deliberations, and via his practitioners and nurses, they cut the leg to Juan Pellicer 4 fingers below the knee, that he believes and is certain that it is the same leg that had been shown to him, and this is true under oath. He claimed that he continued with the treatment of said leg for some months, until he was in the state to have some clothes draped over it, and he claimed this to be true under oath. He claimed that many days after, on different occasions, Juan Pellicer came to the hospital for subsequent treatments, and the patient took medications for the leg, and that Pellicer said to Estanga that he had rubbed oil onto the stump from the lamps of the Virgin of the Pillar.
So here we have the chief surgeon himself saying that 2.5 years ago, Miguel was in his surgery ward, that he tried to cure his leg with many treatments, but they didn't work, so he decided to amputate it. He and his assistant then did this 4 fingers below the knee. Afterwards, he continued to treat the leg for some months until it could be covered with cloth. That would be the recovery period of 5 months in the hospital that Father Pascual referred to. Following this, Miguel came back to the hospital on repeated occasions for follow-up treatments. He continued to take medications for the leg. He told Dr. Estanga that he had been rubbing the stump with oil from the lamps of the Virgin of the Pillar Basilica. Furthermore, Dr. Estanga says that the leg he cut off is the same leg that Miguel now has back, consistent with the reattachment rather than regrowth evidence. And he says all this under oath. So, to summarize, we have sworn testimony from the chief surgeon who said, I'm the one who cut off the leg, I'm the guy who did it, from the assistant surgeon who testified, I helped do it, from the hospital worker who said, I buried the leg, I put it in the ground, and from the priest who attended Miguel during his convalescence in the hospital, in addition to all the people in Zaragoza and Calanda who said they saw Miguel both with the amputated leg, whose stump they touched, and with the restored leg. Consequently, we can't say that this could just be a hoax perpetrated by Miguel. Instead, it would have to be a giant conspiracy involving dozens of people, including the key doctors, other hospital workers, and a priest from the hospital. All of them had up-close personal knowledge of the amputation and its aftermath. Consequently, as Jackson summarizes,
it is historically incontrovertible that dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals, both educated and uneducated, both relatives and non-relatives, attested to witnessing Miguel's leg before and after the healing, and that there were no sworn witnesses attesting anything to the contrary.
That's extremely powerful evidence. Now, if you're a skeptic and your worldview says that miracles simply cannot happen, then your logical course would be to adopt a giant conspiracy theory and say that all of these people, including the doctors and the priests, were simply lying. But it's your ideology rather than the evidence that is driving that conclusion. The evidence that we have at hand points decisively in the other direction. So if you're open-minded about miracles and willing to follow the evidence, then you would conclude that in this case, we have very powerful evidence for a miracle.
Still, it's evidence that's almost 300 years old. Would it be different if a miracle like this occurred in the modern world?
Oh, we can't dismiss evidence just because it's 300 years old. For our purposes, what counts is not how long ago the evidence was gathered, but how quickly it was gathered. As we heard earlier, the first witness statements were taken just 3 days after the miracle was reported, and the investigation took place within a year. As Jackson reports,
after the nearly 11-month investigation, the Archbishop officially declared the miracle as authentic on April 27th, 1641, and Miguel became somewhat of a local celebrity.
So the miracle took place on March 29th. We had the first witness testimony taken 3 days later. Then the Archbishop conducted an 11-month investigation, and he certified the miracle as authentic 1 year and 29 days later. That's remarkably prompt and thorough data gathering, and any modern investigation would be doing good to document the evidence as quickly as that one did. Of course, today we could get more evidence. We could have things like photographs and medical scans and tests, but photographs and medical scans and tests can be faked, and you can always resort to the giant conspiracy theory to explain away the evidence. But it is explaining away the evidence if the evidence at hand all points towards the miracle being authentic, which is the case here.
Is there any way that modern science could shed any light on this case, even at this late date?
Actually, yes. It so happens that in 1958, the Archbishop of Zaragoza, Rigoberto Domenech Val, ordered Miguel Pellicer's remains to be exhumed. It appears that Miguel died on or shortly after September 12th in 1647. That would have been 7.5 years after the miracle, and it would have been when he was 30 years old. Reportedly, some at the time said that he'd lived a dissolute life following the miracle, and that's what led to his early death, but it wasn't rare for people to die at early ages back then, and the accounts of Miguel leading a dissolute life aren't particularly strong, so this could just be an after-the-fact attempt to explain why he died so young. In any event,
the exhumation was conducted at the request of the Archbishop of Zaragoza, Rigoberto Domènech Val, with a total of 33 attendees, including clergy, forensic doctors, and physicians from the Zaragoza School of Medicine. The identity of the bones cannot be known with certainty, but the remains of 17th century clothing and the anatomical features of the bones are consistent with a young man from the time period. An official report published on May 9, 1950, summarizes the findings. Quote, due to their age, probable sex, and antiquity, the remains studied may be those corresponding to Miguel Pellicer. If the historical data that may exist regarding the size and shape of its skull are consistent, moral certainty can be achieved. The existing irregularity in the right tibia and the fact that it is 5.5 millimeters shorter than the left, inversely to the norm, are two circumstances that, although of limited value, can be considered as mere indications in favor of the identification of Miguel Pellicer. End quote. In other words, the remains are consistent with a 17th century man who had suffered from a fractured leg that showed signs of healing in the form of a malunion.
There's even a photograph of the exhumed bones that we'll have a picture of in the video version of the podcast. One of the things that they found, as we heard, was that the right tibia was 5.5 millimeters shorter than the left, which is about a fifth of an inch. And that isn't really significant because 90% of individuals have legs that differ in length by 5.2 millimeters, almost the same amount. What's more significant is that in addition to the length difference, the right tibia also shows an irregularity, which Jackson says is consistent with healing from a fracture. If so, that could be evidence pointing to the reattachment of the leg after its amputation. However, I don't want to make too much out of this because it isn't 100% certain that the bones belong to Pellicer, and because the evidence obtained from them could be explained in other ways. Still, if they are his bones, they appear to be consistent with the miracle report.
It sounds like, based on the abundant and early testimony we have, that there is a serious case here for something paranormal happening. But let me give you some pushback. Why does it have to be a miracle? Why couldn't it have been something like a psychic healing?
This is a classic issue when looking at paranormal occurrences. Psychic abilities are regarded as natural human abilities, whereas miracles would come from sources above human nature, making them supernatural. But when psychic abilities and supernatural sources like God and angels can achieve the same effect, how do you know which is involved in a particular case? To my mind, the best way to try to sort that out is by looking at context. If, in a particular instance, it looks like only a living human tried to produce the effect, then absent any other evidence, you should assume it was the living human who produced it. In other words, that it was psychic. But if, in a particular instance, there was evidence of something other than a living human involved, then that adds evidence to the proposition that it was a supernatural occurrence. In this situation, Miguel was regularly applying oil from the lamps of Our Lady of the Pillar to his stump and appealing to Our Lady of the Pillar for help. And then his leg was restored when he had a dream about the Virgin Mary anointing his leg with oil. So putting all that together, it would suggest that the Virgin Mary was involved in his healing, which normally would be interpreted as God healing him through the Virgin Mary's intercession. I'd also add a second point, which is that while there is evidence for psychic healing abilities in humans, instantly having a leg come back is way beyond what psychic healers are normally able to do. Something like that would be basically unprecedented, and I think that also adds evidence to the view that this was supernatural or beyond what human nature can do, making it a miracle.
Then let's shift over to the faith perspective. What can we say about the miracle of Calanda here?
Well, the faith holds that God is omnipotent, and so he can do miracles, and this would be a particularly striking one, so no surprise there. However, there may be more to say connected with surrounding issues. One of the things that a lot of people think is that miracles are principally done for their sign value. That is, because they are signs that allow us to infer things about God and religion, like which religion is true. And there are cases where miracles are done explicitly in connection with their sign value. One classic example is the resurrection of Jesus. St. Paul tells us in Romans 1:4 that Jesus was designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. So in addition to its other effects, the resurrection of Jesus had sign value that showed us Jesus to be the unique Son of God. St. Paul says he was designated Son of God by his resurrection. An even more straightforward example is, in context, is the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. There, the question is explicitly whether Yahweh is God or whether Baal is God. And Elijah and the prophets of Baal have a miracle contest to see whose deity will send fire from heaven to light the wood under a sacrifice they've prepared. And Elijah has the prophets of Baal go first, and they're working themselves up into a big frenzy, but Baal isn't sending the fire. So Elijah mocks them and says,
"Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Perhaps he is meditating, or is using the bathroom, or is on a journey. Perhaps he is asleep and must wake up."
Most English translations are rather delicate with that "or is using the bathroom" part, and that is a bit of an idiomatic way to translate this text because they didn't actually have bathrooms in ancient Israel. But yes, the Hebrew idiom used there is plausibly taken as an equivalent of the modern idiom of using the bathroom. So what Elijah may be saying is, hey, call out really loud because maybe your God is off taking a poop. The prophets of Baal then go on to an even greater frenzy, but still no fire comes from heaven. And then when it's Elijah's turn, he calls out to Yahweh and whoosh, fire instantly falls and consumes the sacrifice. So this miracle is clearly being performed for its sign value to show that Yahweh really is God and not Baal. But most miracles don't have such direct sign value. Yes, the miracles of Jesus did, like the healing and exorcising people of demons, testify to him and his ministry as being of God, but Jesus did them primarily for two reasons. First, because people had faith in him and he wanted to reward their faith. And second, because they were suffering and he had compassion on them and wanted to relieve their suffering. And I think that these are the principal reasons that God does miracles. Yes, they play a role in strengthening the faith of the people who are aware of them, but primarily they're rewards for the faith of the people who ask for them, and they're products of God's compassion for the suffering people that he loves. Now, the reason I mention all of this is that Caleb Jackson, the gentleman who's done all the research and on this and whose draft chapter I'm relying on, happens to be Protestant. And I think it's really great that he's willing to follow the evidence regarding a miracle involving the Virgin Mary. You know, many Protestants would not do that. But towards the end of the draft chapter, he expresses some discomfort about the fact that the miracle would reinforce the faith of some Catholics who did things that he regards as bad, like the Spanish conquistadors in the New World or the Spanish inquisitors in the Old World. And he wonders, why would God do a miracle knowing that this would happen?
And what would you say in response to these concerns?
A few things. First, Caleb seems to be relying on some one-sided and not fully accurate narratives regarding the conquistadors and the Inquisition. There are other sides to those stories. For example, he mentions the conquistadors enslaving people in the New World, but he doesn't cover the fact that the popes of the period, like Paul III, were trying to stop the enslavement of native peoples. In his document, Sublimus Deus, Paul III wrote,
"The said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect.
So that was what the church had established. What some conquistadors were doing, it was contrary to what the Pope had directed. And I wouldn't think that God should refrain from doing a miracle on the grounds that it might confirm conquistadors in their faith and then lead to them doing more bad things, any more than I would say God shouldn't heal someone because it would strengthen disobedient Catholic politicians like Nancy Pelosi in their faith and lead her to kill more babies. The fact is, enslaving Catholic conquistadors and pro-abortion Catholic politicians have both turned their backs on what the church wants. And if anything, doing a miracle to strengthen their faith would be expected to have the effect of getting them to take the faith more seriously and stop doing things like enslaving people or aborting babies. Secondly, by the 1640s, the Spanish had already conquered the parts of the New World that they would come into control of. And further, the connection between the miracle of Calanda and the conquistadors is remote. And I don't think you can expect God to not do a miracle to help a suffering person in one part of the world on the grounds that people on the other side of the planet might do bad things in lands they were already in control of, when you'd expect the miracle to have the opposite effect and make them more merciful in keeping with the faith if they even became aware of it.
What about the Inquisitors? They were right there in Spain.
Yes, but we have to look at the Spanish Inquisition realistically and not simply buy into the black legend created around it by anti-Catholics, whether they were Protestants or Enlightenment freethinkers. The Spanish Inquisition was by no means perfect, but it was actually a much gentler and more merciful institution than the secular legal authorities were. In fact, we have records of people committing blasphemy in secular courts so that they could get their cases transferred to the Inquisition. And frankly, nobody has clean hands in this area. Protestant authorities persecuted Catholics violently. Freethinkers of the later French Revolution persecuted Christians violently. And secular authorities everywhere in this age were cruel. So it's not like doing a miracle to help a suffering man in a Catholic country was going to markedly increase the amount of wickedness in that area compared to other areas. In fact, by being a sign of God's compassion, it would set an example of us needing to be compassionate towards others, because Jesus tells us quite firmly in the Sermon on the Mount that we need to imitate God's mercy and compassion.
It sounds like you don't think that one should put that much weight on possible negative effects of the miracle on people like the conquistadors and the Inquisitors.
No, and a further reason is that I don't think it's wise to look at miracles in terms of long-term implications like that. We humans have such a narrowly focused field of vision that we can't see the long-term implications of miracles, especially in a post-biblical age. God can make a judgment about whether it's advisable to do a miracle in a particular situation, but we can't. So I think that we have to leave those decisions to Him. What's more, I think that we need to stick with why God does miracles for individual people to begin with. This isn't a big sign miracle like the resurrection or the contest of the prophets of Baal. It wasn't done to tell people which religion is right. Yes, it would strengthen the faith of people who knew about it, but it wasn't for the purpose of telling which religion is true. It was done to have compassion on a suffering man. And among other reasons, it was done because he prayed to the Virgin Mary and asked for help. I think God has mercy for and heals people of all religions. That's why He gave us immune systems and self-healing abilities. And it's why He sometimes helps us by healing us even without it being an identifiable miracle. It's because He loves us and He responds when we ask for help. I'd say that Protestants would also have healing miracles through the Virgin Mary's intercession too, if they asked for more of them. So I just don't think that we should interpret the miracle of Calanda through the lens of it being some kind of sign miracle telling us whether or which understanding of the Christian faith is true. I think we should just say, thank you, and praise God that He did it.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
The miracle of Calanda is an astonishingly well-documented one. We have a large amount of testimony taken from the key people involved in the case, including the doctors who performed the amputation, a man who buried the limb, and a priest who attended Miguel Pellicer during his hospital convalescence, as well as numerous witnesses who saw both the absence of the leg before the miracle and its presence afterwards, and who got to physically examine it up close and touch it. There are no plausible natural explanations for this. You could propose a giant conspiracy, but we don't have evidence for a giant conspiracy, so you'd be explaining away the evidence that we do have, not explaining it. Thus, unless your ideology tells you otherwise, if you follow the evidence, it points to the miracle of Calanda being real.
So, Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listener and viewer?
We'll have a link to Caleb Jackson's book, Undead, a historical investigation into the most famous miracle in history, in other words, the resurrection of Jesus. Also, Caleb's book, Searching for a Solution to Suffering, a Christian Response to the Problem of Evil. Cameron Bertuzzi's Capturing Christianity channel, the virgin birth debate that Caleb and I did on that channel. Also, information about Benedict XIV, that's Cardinal Prospero Lambertini before his election, or after his election. The 1946 song, The Old Lamplighter. Also, Vittorio Messori's interview about the miracle. Information and videos about salamander limb regeneration. Why can we regrow a liver? Children regrowing fingertips. Can you regrow severed limbs like a salamander? Regrowing human body parts, is it possible? And Mandy Sellers, Shrinking My 17-Stone Legs.
And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the miracle of Calanda and the miraculous reappearance of Miguel Pellicer's leg? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. You can watch the episode at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin, and you can help me because I'm trying to grow my channel, and you can help with that by liking and commenting on the video, which tells YouTube you found it interesting, so YouTube should show it to other people. Also, I am trying to grow the channel, and you can help by subscribing. And when you subscribe, be sure to hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video, whether it's Mysterious World or one of the other videos I have coming out every week. Thank you very much for helping. I also want to say a special thanks to Caleb Jackson for sharing his research into this miracle with me, and we'll be keeping you updated when his book, including that chapter we were quoting from, comes out.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week is a Fifth Friday, and so we're going to be doing our usual Fifth Friday Weird Questions episode. I'll be talking about questions like, can Padre Pio still absolve penitents even though he's in heaven? Could a Catholic couple get married without a priest after a civilization-destroying disaster? What is the realm of Sheol in the Bible? Are speaking in tongues and resting in the Spirit genuine spiritual phenomena? What about people who claim that they don't need to eat in order to stay alive? Which human ancestors would we be inclined to baptize if they were still alive? And more.
Excellent. Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should make sure to hit that bell to get notifications. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt. I'm wearing an example of one now. You can also get the design on a mug or other types of merchandise in our shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/313. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com.
Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.
He made the night a little brighter. Wherever he would go, the old lamplighter of long, long ago. His snowy hair was so much whiter beneath the candle glow. The old lamplighter of long, long ago. You'd hear the patter of his feet as he came toddling down the street. His smile would hide a lonely heart, you see. If there were sweethearts in the park, he'd pass a lamp and leave it dark, remembering the days that used to be. For he recalls when dreams were new, he loved someone who loved him too, who walks with him alone in memory. He made the night a little brighter. Wherever he would go, the old lamplighter of long, long ago. The night a little brighter. Wherever he would go, the old lamplighter of long, long ago. Now if you look up at the sky, you'll understand the reason why the little stars at night are all aglow. He turns them on when night is here. He turns them off when dawn is near. The little man we loved of long ago.